Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. It's great to have you with us. If you're joining for the first time, say that the whole point of these talks and the whole point of the Mitchell Center is to grow our shared capacity for working on sustainability problems, which maybe there's no simple definition, but for us, they're usually about this need to think about the well-being of people and the well-being of the natural world and all the connections between them. And when we do that here, we're often asking, how can we strengthen partnerships between a university like this one and lots of different kinds of communities across Maine and beyond? And then how can we weave together different kinds of knowledge, know-how, creativity, use that and link it with actions, right? Not just the knowledge part, create a sustainable future. We're also trying to learn from many different kinds of leaders and problem solvers, and these talks are one way for us to do that. Got a great mix of talks in the coming weeks. Some of them were on the slides earlier. Next Monday at this time, Dr. Karen Bielek, who did her PhD with us a while back, will be here to talk about the science and practice of building strong collaborations between universities and colleges, and then these diverse partners that can include tribal nations, non-governmental organizations, government, civil society, business and industry, and on and on. If you miss one of our talks, we actually have a YouTube channel. And so you can catch it there, going back about a decade. So lots to binge watch. Run out of binge watching right now. And I'm not going to. Now it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Tony Sutton. One of the keys to creating a sustainable future, I used to think the key was just get going, work really hard, in either a year or two, you'll get this done and you can move on to something else. Turns out it's not as easy as I thought to make progress on these problems. So plan B, I have a lot of plan B, C, and D, is that we're always growing the next generation of leaders. Got to do that because it's going to take a while. One of the most rewarding parts of my job, and this is the serious part, is getting to watch the magical process of watching those leaders grow before your very eyes. And that's what's happened in my experiences working with Tony. Him for more than 15 years. I met him when he was working on his master's degree with the Micmac Farms. I got to watch him even more closely when he was doing his doctoral dissertation, working on rivers for his PhD. Tony, I don't know if I said that's what I did for my PhD, but I approached it somewhat differently. Every step of the way, I marveled at his ability to engage with students, ignite their passions, and help them look at the world from different vantage points, always emphasizing the rich relations with nature. It's a joy to meet someone like Tony, who already has many leadership skills. He did when I met him, and then watch him become an even more inspiring, yet even more humble leader. Please join me in welcoming Tony.
Yes, I know. Look at this. Already starting. I don't have to do my gratitude slide because David already did it for me. But yeah, I always like to start, like, the reason why I'm studying rivers is because I was a graduate student doing work in a community, and I was like my own community. And I said, well, what matters to us? And it was my mentor, Ed Bassett, who introduced me to the Sipayik River, or it's also referred to as the St. Croix. That's kind of started this journey, and I've just been studying rivers ever since then. But also, like, the Mitchell Center has been kind of like a place where I keep coming back to. Again, it was my master's. Karen, who gets to talk the other week, I was doing my master's while she was doing her PhD. But yeah, I got fieldwork monies through a scholarship program here to do my fieldwork during my PhD. And so it all comes back to the Mitchell Center in many ways. So Yeah, I guess what are we going to talk about today? Well, one, I want to spend a lot of time looking at this image here, and we're going to keep kind of coming back to that. And I think like one of the reasons why I had that profound is like that was just my dinner one week. I don't eat like that every day, but I was like, me being a Wabanaki food person, like this is really the goal of a lot of our work. Like this is what we're trying to get to, but at the same time, it's very infrequent. It's very complicated. Um, and also, since I'm a co-author on this MITSC Sea Run report, it's all inherently about fish, but a lot of my work encompasses a lot of different things. So I want to start with MITSC Sea Run report, and then I want to work through kind of like three sort of vignettes, so to speak. And I was talking earlier, I was like, it might be frustrating for some people because I'm going to start a lot of conversations and then really just provide people with resources and topics and ways they can advance their learning in that area. And then I'm going to move on to another subject, and then we'll finish with like, you know, how do we go forward with this sort of with this conversation? So I guess like first off, let me say like why am I doing this in the way that I am? I guess I'm motivated by clams. So in a book that I'm a part of, which Dr. McGreevy, who's also been here for a really long time as well, is leading. She had us finishing up our concluding chapter. We're actually, oh, they said don't do that. Don't point at the screen. This little green dot down here at the bottom, we're meeting down here to write in place. That's a method that we commonly use. And this question that she posed to us, she says, how has our work changed now opposed to, you know, like 5 years ago when we were doing a lot of clam restoration work? And they had this image in this conservation place of Taunton Bay. And the whole time we're having this conversation, I'm just super distracted by looking at Taunton Bay, because from my perspective, it looks like an artery. If you look at how the tides flow in and out of bays over like a video loop of it, it looked like the pulsing of that. I call these sites of sustenance. They're very special places. They organize very diverse lifeways like ours in one place. And that was kind of like my response to my question. It's like I'm still doing work with clamming, but I'm also engaging in a lot of conversations that are happening on the land as well. And in many ways, it's the same sort of process, but with entirely different groups of people who probably don't talk to each other as well. So when I was putting together this presentation, I was like, I really wanted to talk about all aspects of my work, not just like the fisheries component, but really kind of link them together. Yeah, to get us started, though, just thinking a little bit about the Sea Run report. It's a policy document. It's funny, in my undergrad, I never thought I'd be doing like a lot of policy because it's like my hardest class, but now I'm like thinking in it all the time. Super important. But the task of this report was very simple. It was to document all non-Indigenous, well, it's simple to state, it's probably harder to do, document all non-Indigenous impacts to freshwater fisheries from contact to the present. So it's a pretty like comprehensive report. And in terms of like the title of this presentation, it tells like part of the story of what happened to our food. And that was an elder who was talking to me one time when he learned what I was doing for school. He said, well, nobody knows the story of what happened to our food. This report tells part of that. And it's free too. You can download it as PDF and then also an audiobook, and it's chaptered out by the different sections. So if you just want to read or listen to one section, you can do that. But this is kind of like the layout. The first section just looks at issues related to sustenance, and I'll talk about what that term means. The second one, well, technically the third is more about, that's the answer to the question. What are all the non-Indigenous impacts to freshwater fisheries? So that's sort of the bulk of the report. And then we also end with some different examples of collaboration. So you can check those out as well. But yeah, coming back to this plate, again, I want to keep coming back to that and look at why some of these different parts of the plate can be informed through like Sea Run. And from like, just for starting point, from the state of Maine's perspective, none of the food on this plate would be considered sustenance. It would actually be empty from their standpoint. So that's why conceptual orientations matter. And that's why we'll start with the term sustenance itself. So drawing from this quote, Eben has this great quote. It says, knowledge is power, but those who exert control over definitions of knowledge, including how it is constituted and validated and which cognitive tools are salient, possess an even greater source of power. The way that I see that come up with sustenance is the state of Maine gets to define sustenance. And under their definition, it says, as all non-commercial consumption or use of marine organisms by tribal members, they exclude Abenaki, and C-Run will let you know why, within their territories or by a tribal member's immediate family. And what that last one means is like if your partner is not a tribal member, you can still eat dinner that night. But that's sustenance from their perspective. So again, when we look at this image, none of that food would be considered sustenance because that's Mi'kmaq Farms raised brook trout that comes from their aquaculture facility in Presque Isle. I acquired that because they donated it to the Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness Food Pantry, who acquired these monstrous fiddleheads from the county. I think they just grow bigger up there. Is anyone from the county? Can you verify this? There's nobody. Yeah. And then I got this wild rice from New Westcook, another Indigenous organization who got that from the Red Lake Nation. And then the maple syrup and the Passamaquoddy blueberries both come from both of the Passamaquoddy companies that I'm using to flavor that wild rice. Those are commercial entities. So again, none of those aspects of sustenance would be included within the state's definition. I'll talk about why that matters later, but let's talk about what sustenance is. So if you're interested in conversations about sustenance, pages 24 through 32 outline a lot of the, I would say, like nuances of how we think about sustenance. It's not meant to be a definition, but I mean, if we're doing it over 8 pages, it just tells you it's very complex. So a couple ideas that are relevant to this talk. One, our food always gets reduced to the practice and not like the caretaking. But one of the contributions we have from linguist Roger Paul is saying like a lot of our words don't state things that we need or want. They express our obligations to creation. And there's a lot going on in that just quote as well, like our obligation to creation could be the food sharing between us as people, but also my care for those species and those relatives to make sure that they live out their lives as well. That's expressing obligations to creation. Sustenance is also about our places of pedagogy. I like to say those are our classrooms. And one way that colonialism has impacted all of us is we spend way too much time in places like this. And I'm not saying I'm sad that you all are here. I'm saying it's out of balance. And some of our most profound educational experiences happen outside. In my fall Wabanaki Foodways class, I've been trying to take them into both the woods and the campus kitchens. So if you're a faculty member and you want to use the Hitchner Hall kitchens, you should. But when I was in the kitchen cooking them fry bread, I realized it's like, well, our places of pedagogy also had kitchens too. They were just all over. And the last aspect of sustenance that's central to this talk that we'll elaborate on quite a bit is movement. So rather than thinking about food as stationary, like these are different places, like where I live and I raise my pigs and my agriculture, like all this stuff in one spot, it's really about movement between different places. So specifically, well, where are we going? Movement from the fresh water and the salt water. So thinking springtime, this is going to be like some of the foods that we have to celebrate those sort of freshwater places. I like to think that stuff like brook trout and fiddleheads have been eaten together for like hundreds of years. It's not just some new like gentrified kind of food that people are serving. They've been paired together for a long time. Versus like looking at some of our saltwater foods, the reason why you're like blueberries aren't saltwater, but you know, a lot of the barrens that we have are usually close to the coast. And when I take people out to dig clams, they're often sharing stories about picking blueberries with their families or like vice versa. So a lot of those relatives kind of get connected in that way. Within that movement, the rivers were and are sort of highways for moving around that. So all this image, I just stole it just so I could have a map that had some rivers on there. The Schudig River, don't point, is over here. But again, yeah, these are the sort of highways for that movement. As one example, I was doing a presentation down in Brooklyn, and I wanted to think about, well, what's the traditional travel route to get from the Pusha, like up here, down to Naskeg Point, because both of those are historically very like dense fishing locations. So I just threw it on Google Maps to see like how it would take me down there. And it's actually pretty close to the traditional sort of travel route. The big differences would be is if you're coming this way, sorry, pointing, you would portage through this first part here, and then you could cut across through Blue Hill or go down through the coast as well. There's another route that goes more through Ellsworth, through like the Union River too, but just for the purposes of this talk, you can kind of get a sense that these travel routes are actually still pretty consistent. And just to think about Naskeg Point for a little bit, again, like we don't want our minds slipping back to like this is just for like fishing and doing other stuff. This is Naskeg Point, by the way. But I like this quote because it's referring to these places being the staging grounds for trapping, fishing, clamming, sea mammal hunting, and beyond. Like the staging grounds for me, it's like this is a food processing place. This is not just the Hannaford, this is the Hannaford distribution system center. And when we look at it from that standpoint, there's only like 2, the last time I checked, distribution centers in the whole state. Why that's important is because Naskeg Point was also historically an important place for governance. So that means that place could host large gatherings of people, feed them, and make sure the obligations to creation are sustained, both with their guests that are arriving, but not depleting those fisheries so you can't come back to that place. So again, these places are super important for many reasons. There are classrooms, there are religious places, everything happens within these gathering locations. So just briefly, kind of like wrapping up this sort of idea on like why starting with concepts matters and what happens to that. Well, one, the first point, funding calls recenter traditionally Eurocentric notions of agriculture. So I think it was last year I saw an infrastructure call. So a lot of the food growers I work with, infrastructure is a big need for them. And the one in particular that I was reading specifically excluded wild harvest. So if we're looking at the foods on that plate, it's not really helping support infrastructure for foods that are on that plate. And we look at Maine's food sovereignty legislation as another example. It's recentering, again, agriculture predominantly within that, as well as it doesn't do good with handling something like fisheries. Like it tends to empower municipal governments. But what if another entity above your government is polluting the food that you're eating? It doesn't think very well with that. And like I said, lastly, where we started, it removes the monetary aspects associated with food, which have always existed. It was actually somewhere around the 1600s, I forget the exact part, but it was when the fur trade was being introduced to this territory. It was like, oh, we already have economics. We understand this system. So my ancestors not only excelled at that system, but they got so good at it that the European governments were like, hey, we need to regulate this. They're like kind of cutting us out. So yeah, some of the first regulations against us were economic. So if you're sort of interested in that conversation, there's just a number of resources and there's some handouts with these resources as well. And we're distributing different electronic copies too, because again, I want to start these conversations and give people, connect them to things that help them think about that. So one, use CRUN, PDF and audiobook to look at sustenance. Sometimes I like to assign audiobooks or podcasts in my class because I find it's a nice way to introduce people to concepts that might be complex. And it's also a nice way to balance it out because you all have to read tons of stuff anyway. So it's nice to have to get to listen to something for a chance. If you want to experience movement yourself, Maine Rivers has this cool like Alewife Trail Finder map. So river herring are going to be migrating in the spring and they're super cool. I always say the most important thing I could do for my job is getting like youth and adults who are youth at heart out to rivers to see these river migrations. So that map helps you find the places that are close to you, as well as the Maine Department of Education has a Wabanaki Medicines and Food Moons Guide, which is pretty cool to think about this idea of moons. Like our ancestors were super smart, as it turned out. Like they could understand what position the stars and the moon were in and where they needed to be in terms of their gathering. So this is a nice curriculum piece that kind of gets you connected to that. So again, coming back to this place, we can start to understand why concepts matter because again, by the state's definition, none of the food on that plate would matter. Well, it matters, but it wouldn't be considered sustenance from their viewpoint. But let's look at the first sort of question I have is, well, why are Mi'kmaq raising brook trout in an aquaculture facility? And they've been super successful for doing this for a long time. But let's just ask that question, why using sea run? I talk a lot about sea runs, so I'm trying to do this in like the briefest way possible. So what I'm going to do is break it down in kind of like 3 ideas. Some I'll move through with more things to say than others. But when I get to the third part of this presentation, when I look at some of these land-based foods, I want to try and look at it in a kind of parallel structure. So I'll use access, dams, and other barriers and pollution, like again, but think with it in a sort of different way. So let's look at the fish on this plate to start with. One, I use the term access just because it's utilized a lot in fisheries today. Like for clammers, access is typically like a physical access standpoint. But for many Wabanaki, access was something that was intentionally separated. We were intentionally separated through it by policy. At least for that policy originally. I'd like to stop here for a second. This is along the Androscoggin River where the Topsom Brunswick sort of line is. If you've been to the Sea Dog there, that's where it is. And that also makes it ironic when you're thinking about fish. But basically, pre-Revolutionary War, the British government had a really hard time fighting us. And it was because of our abilities to move and access food. So they developed new policies, which were against previous treaty rights, and built forts at these key sites of sustenance. And they were offensive forts, so they were meant to hurt people, not just defend what they would claim as their territory. But this specific location is described as having some of the finest sturgeon and salmon that non-Indigenous people had seen. And that's also why I like to freeze right here, because if anyone's ever seen a sturgeon, I'd just love to see one get up that fish ladder. That's another kind of conversation, but that's where this separation of food starts. It starts at this location, and it was repeated across the Kennebec as well as the Penobscot rivers. In the Penobscot, it's a little bit different because it's in the bay, not along the river as the other forts were built. But you can't read this sign, so I'm just going to read it for you. You can go read this today, so it's not even my argument that we were intentionally separated from fisheries. It's literally right in that sign. It says a fort at this location would be of utmost importance because it would drive off the remains of the Norridgewock, that's a band of Abenaki and Penobscot, from their hunting and fishing territories to basically open up the shipping channels for trade, which is ironic because that's the same conversation that's happening here with Sears Island. Sears Island is the next landmass down from there. But basically they wanted to develop timber, and they're willing to engage in genocide to do that. That's why they said the remains of. And when we go back to that map of movement, this is the Penobscot Bay here at the bottom. That fort sits right there. So when we're looking at that, we can tell like these are a lot of the motivations likely for my ancestors and others to fight in the Revolutionary War is because our food sources were being targeted, or our classrooms, or however you want to think about them. And after like the Revolutionary War ended, you'd think we would get some of these places back, but instead they developed them for industrial use. Now this dam has been decommissioned and it's on the Schutic River, so it doesn't follow this same sort of pattern. But that video I showed you earlier, I'm standing at a fort that literally then became a massive dam within that location as well. And this is a pattern that repeated across all of the major river systems. And again, another full circle moment, Mitchell Center talk by Sam Roy made this map of all the dams and culverts in the state of Maine. Now, this is a more contemporary map. When we're looking, all the yellow dots are dams. And sometimes you show this, like people think the black dots are part of the mapping, but those are culverts. So those things that also are water crossings that we have to think about in terms of fish moving around. But historically, this map would not look much better. On the Penobscot River alone, there was over, I think, 100 dams with sawmills attached to them. So that's a rapid industrialization of rivers, not to mention all the blasting and environmental movement they had to move to get timber down the rivers. And also, it's not to mention that all these industries within these river systems were using the rivers as their wastewater system as well. So lots of contamination occurring. And to go back to the Androscoggin for a second, it was the white houses along the Androscoggin that eventually turned black because of the pollution that they started nuisance complaints to say, hey, we got to fix this pollution. And one idea that comes up within this is you have these emergent management structures that are occurring when one, Indigenous people aren't in these areas anymore and probably politically don't have the agency to engage in those conversations. Anyways, that's like a fancy way of saying they wouldn't let us in the conversation. And we'll kind of come back to that idea as well. So when we look at this plate and we say, well, why are the Mi'kmaq raising brook trout in the facility? Well, one, it comes from access issues that are longstanding and still persistent in today's sort of world, but also all the pollution that those river fisheries have had to endure as well. So if they're going to have to be able to eat fish in any meaningful quantity, this project allows them to do that. But if we're just looking at like the fish on the plate, you know, we're not seeing all these other like beautiful forms of food as well. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to need to introduce some new friends to our conversation. So I'll start with Sea Run as a segue is like I need to get river histories, but also talk about the land. But we can start that conversation with Sea Run. And again, I'll introduce some other sources to help us. But this quote helps us connect those conversations. The state of Maine authorized, again, that's a nice way of saying stolen, the development of Passamaquoddy land near Indian Township to support paper companies. Like they're not even obvious, they're not even being discreet with this. It's just full on for people to see, including the land sold to the St. Croix Paper Company to build the Grand Falls Dam. And then Maine also gave the company permission to flood the Passamaquoddy tribal land for the dam's reservoir. So it's like, not only are you taking the land, but then you're flooding the land, which is going to reduce access to number of food gathering places. So when we look back at this image, we can see the impact of dams is not just about what's happening to the fish, but that's where fiddleheads grow. They grow in the floodplains that are adjacent to the rivers. So if all that upstream flooding is happening, then all those species have to adapt to that as well. Another good project that I have a link for as well is the Pajibscot Portage Mapping Project. They're specifically focused on the Androscoggin River, sort of reinserting narratives of place. So if you're a nerd like me and you like maps, I would check it out. But this quote comes from there. But because of the low-lying area was flooded by spring melts every year, Ragamaguk, which is just north of that dam that we saw, was good ground for planting our crops like corn, beans, and squash. But when we come back to this image, we got to understand that many of those wild foods and those crops that we're talking about are also going to be impacted by this type of development as well. So to kind of make a more solid connection to how sort of conservation or land protection sort of emerges within this context, we did a subsequent publication myself with Hans Carlson, who at the time was working for Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and Darren Ranco here on campus. But the basic argument of this paper is that conservation in Maine developed in a time where we couldn't access the land. So outdoor recreation, which is what land protection is trying to support, is actually defined from a sort of non-Indigenous standpoint. This is why, again, concepts sort of matter. So this paper kind of utilizes a lot of the same sort of sources and structures that Sea Run does, but it applies them to a different context. Remember, like all my work is the same sort of thinking, but with different partners. Now, with access, we start that story very similarly. It's the one you all just heard and saw from the Androscoggin River. Something that we need to introduce to this as well is I want to draw on Potawatomi scholar Kyle White real quick, and a quote from him. Different forms of colonialism, whether through environmental destruction, land disposition, or forced relocation, have ended Indigenous peoples' relationship to thousands of plants, animals, insects, and ecosystems. So it's from that perspective, I'm trying to understand access. And Kyle White's really good at that because we can also consider things like issues of contamination as a part of access as well. But if we're thinking about that in terms of access, I know I crossed it off. Let's just go back here for a second. So after Maine became a state in the 19th century, Michael Pauling does a really good job of articulating how many of our ancestors were still moving. We were still accessing these places we want to go to, but emergent policy structures were created that restricted our movement. In other words, if we're trying to go to the places we would want to go to, we could be punished by law. And again, he does a very good job of outlining this policy. And very interestingly, this paper is occurring within the same river system. So again, if we think about Fort Pownell here in the Bay was intended to just disconnect us from fisheries. Policy becomes the next, well, that was a policy. The next iteration of policies are American policies to do that. In the 20th century, so the other shift that we see is that post-World War II, a lot of the non-Indigenous public is recognizing that, hey, if we go outside, it's really good for our well-being. And it is. We should get outside as much as possible. But this was fueling a lot of people's interest in outdoor recreation. And this was taken at like a camp I was staying at one time. This is like their decorations. And I was like, that's such a perfect representation of this time. You have two like non-Indigenous people. They're like on a birch bark canoe that was probably made by us, doing outdoor things. So again, this is a time where people are being encouraged to do these things. Land is emerging to support those types of behaviors. And at the same time, we can't do this. During this century, we see the development of things like residential schools, probably even before this too. But our youth are being taken and they're being punished for articulating some of the very knowledge used to like make that boat, for instance. So again, it's a time period where we can't really participate in this conversation. So if we go back to this story where I talk about the emergent policy structures that are sort of created in our absence, remember like 100 sawmills on the Penobscot River alone, like we need the trees to feed those sawmills. So you've got a lot of impact happening to the land, as well as, again, people's interest in outdoor recreation. And that's sort of the context where you have conservation emerging in Maine. And interestingly, when they started thinking about how we then shape the land for these outdoor recreation experiences, even things like the forestry companies were thinking about it as well. And there's this great quote where they're talking about the timber harvesting of the North Woods was actually reflecting people's needs for outdoor recreation, like fall foliage, which is something that's still celebrated. And you should celebrate that because the fall foliage is beautiful. But again, I'm just proving a point that a lot of these outdoor recreation experiences are geared towards this sort of non-Indigenous perspective. And very interestingly, it was timber roads very early on that were providing the access for these opportunities. Then you have the development of like conservation groups who are going to help that access a little bit more. And what we kind of arrive at is, and this isn't like a dig at Land for Maine's future, we could substitute this for anything, but land groups utilize a lot of different funding sources to acquire land to protect it. And many of those funding sources come along with restrictions. These are how you can use the land, and these are ways you can't use the land. And in some ways that can be permanent. And that permanent can be till the end of time, as I like to say. And somebody corrected me. They said, the end of the political era. And I was like, well, that's kind of like the same thing, but who knows? But in terms of this conversation, again, like upwards of 20% of the land in Maine is managed by some type of conservation group. And they all have different ways of, regulating that land use. So let's just do a quick example. We'll go back to Taunton Bay. Sorry for how bright this is. You can blame the ArcGIS map, but again, I love maps. And this is an ArcGIS map that just shows conservation parcels within this region. Now, I didn't do an exhaustive search, but just like doing a quick search, there was 5 conservation groups within this area alone, and 3 of those were just the state's ones. It was like the state protected wildlife area, the state public lands, and then they got the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Like those are distinct staffs and entities and missions in terms of like land protections. Coming back to this image, if we're just looking at wild rice, the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has an internal policy that restricts wild rice harvesting of any type. So you actually can't do that. So that's probably why groups like in West Cook get that from other sources if wild harvest is limited. Versus some conservation groups do allow for the harvest of wild rice. But again, the big kind of concern is sometimes like commercial entities want to come in and really harvest and do a lot of impact. But when we look at something like fiddleheads, there's actually a lot more access to something like that, but it's usually because the broader public has an interest in fiddleheads as well. So there tends to be more access to something like that. But yeah, when we come back to this plate, we can start to see that these river histories are really, attached to all of these relatives in different ways. And if you're interested in these, it's hard conversations about conservation, I practice that a lot. It's hard to say. Here's just a number of a couple different sources. Beth Rose Middleton has a great book about conservation groups working with tribal nations to reacquire territory and sort of like what comes out of that work. As well as there's another good report that was done recently, the Partnerships for Indigenous Land Access and Return. They actually have a case study on Newescook, the group I was just mentioning, and the land return that they received that they're allowed to do their food work on. The Pajibscot Portage Project, again, I already talked about that one, but it's a cool mapping project. And like lastly, like the article we were sharing is a good one. Our whole goal for that article was to show how conservation emerged within this context, but it comes from river histories. So what are the implications of this? Because we're almost done and I promise not to talk too much, so I'm doing a good job. I think instead of saying something like fish passage, it's really easy to say something like food passage. And now we have to start considering other things besides the numbers of fish in rivers and how a hydroelectric capacity is impacted or not. We have to consider other things like pollution, like access to fishing places, like land disposition, like abilities to engage in those management systems. Those are all part of restoration when we're thinking about something like food passage. And that's why at the University of Maine, and it kind of looks like it does today, it's bright and shiny. I wanted to make sure there was still snow on the ground because I didn't want to give everyone false hope. But again, when I come back to our mission as like a land, sea, space grant, and there's probably some other ones in there too. Our mission is to serve communities. So why this conversation matters is it allows us to understand the whole like ecosystem or web of problems that can be attached to something. And it really becomes like mutual beneficial as well, which I'll show just an example in a second. But yeah, both of these papers I draw on pretty heavily. Dr. Carrie Norgard talking about like even the title of the book, Salmon and Acorns, are already thinking about the management of rivers from a more holistic perspective. This is not just a conversation about the water, but it's about the land as well. Yeah, and the next one, Dr. Whitney Maurer, also very similarly looking at river restoration from, again, more sort of holistic sort of perspectives, like the one I was just defining. Kind of more close to home, Fox et al. Have this nice sort of case study looking at different restoration efforts occurring in different areas, which is a nice one. And then lastly, like selfish plug for my own work. Yeah, I make that argument, fish passage to food passage, just to help us understand that something like river restoration, like the outcomes in many ways have been conceptualized even before it started. So I'm trying to create more space for a topic like food. Again, going back to Kyle White, if we can't access those food or those relatives are too polluted, then we can't actually enact the things that's bringing us to that conversation. So when we go to the recommendations, I like how I get this at the end. That's kind of like the report, but one thing I was going to say at the beginning, but I forgot, is people have this tendency to skip the story and move straight to the recommendations. But if we did that, we would have no context for like what this recommendation is suggesting, which is over time, expand and restore traditional practices, including specific policies on movement to and access to key sites of sustenance. Because again, we're intentionally disconnected through various different policies. Or the easiest way to understand it is like sometimes dams are still occupying those places where our ancestors walked. Also recognizing that balance is required in relation to hunting, fishing, and gathering all those land-based foods in between. I think at the time we wrote balance just because I hear different stories of people. There's some people who, like, for instance, don't want to eat moose meat because that's all they grew up eating, because that's all they had access to. And then I've heard the same stories for people who they've only had fish and they didn't have access to those other relatives as well. And they're kind of like, again, sort of sick of eating fish all the time. So when we think about balance, we're trying to think again, restoring movement so we can have that balance again, which includes freshwater and saltwater fisheries. Just briefly, plug for Dr. Hillier's work, another person who comes from this Mitchell Center space, but this more holistic view of thinking about our work is not just beneficial to Indigenous communities, but non-Indigenous as well. This is just an example of sort of like how that holistic view looks. So when Gabby was doing this work with clammers who are experiencing water pollution coming from rivers, and we can kind of now understand why we have so many pollution issues related to rivers. Sea Run helps us know that. But what Gabby did was got all these different people involved in water quality throughout a watershed, got them into a room together. And what she found out is that many of those people hadn't even met each other. And that was a huge resource to clammers because now they just know who to talk to when they've got specific questions and problems. We don't need to get into the water quality decision tree, but it's that idea like back in Taunton Bay, there's this web of things occurring in there, but people aren't really having those conversations together. So it can really be mutually beneficial. The last sort of implication I want to talk about is the saltwater. We actually do talk about saltwater in the report as well, but since it's a policy document, again, policy likes to compartmentalize things. But I was saying, well, if we're going to talk about food, one, we got to define what we're talking about in terms of food, or at least come to like a broad understanding. And two, we also need to include the saltwater. But when we were invited, we were invited to share for the this special report on our shared ocean. We were able to contribute. Yeah, these are Wabanaki fisheries, or these are our sort of some perspective, anyways, on how it relates to fisheries. And kind of like the basic idea is, I think we should be honored in the conversations that we're in currently, and also we should be aware of the problems that might be inherently Indigenous as well. So again, kind of going back to this map, unlike most people engaging in fisheries conversations who are non-Indigenous, we were intentionally separated from fisheries through policies. So that's something that still needs to be thought through. Especially related to clams and these are mussels as well. They're hanging out together. I was getting a little crazy when I was cooking those up. But that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in shellfish is that many of the freshwater relatives are polluted, so we can't eat them in meaningful quantities. But clams and other things are relatively low in pollution. It's a policy barrier that separates us from them. And again, that article I just looked at helps elaborate on that. So when we look at clam management briefly, I have to say it's a land-centric management system. I'm probably the only one who says that, but this is what I mean by that. So the state of Maine allocates rights to harvesting to a municipal government that's along the coast. Now, when we look at, so that means the more land you hold as a municipal government, the more territory you have for harvesting clams. Whenever you drive into a municipal territory like Ellsworth, it's always like you drive for like 3 or 4 miles and you don't see anything. And then all of a sudden, like a town happens. But when you look at the reservations, they're like these tiny little parcels of land. So Maine has 3,600 miles of coastline. And this is the place where Wabanaki, specifically Passamaquoddy and Sipayik, can harvest clams. Can everybody see it? Right there. I had the arrow. And I think even that dot is probably being probably being generous, but that's also where the Passamaquoddy clam gardens are if you want to check out another project. But these articles advocating these issues might be distinctly Indigenous, and we need to call those to attention as well. So again, kind of coming back to the recommendations, that's why we're saying consider increasing access to other lower pollution foods like clamming or Mi'kmaq Farms aquaculture, as well as consider amending sustenance to include communities opposed to solely individual and or family household sort of sustenance. Because again, if we're going to be re-accessing lower pollution foods, it would be nice to be able to share them with our broader relatives, not just those within our household. So again, just some kind of like closing thoughts on some of like the terrain that we go over, and then we'll have plenty of time for some questions. And then I know students have to get out of here, so don't feel free like you have to stay. But again, like starting with concepts, they matter because by the state's perspective, none of the food on this plate would be considered sustenance. But that's how we articulate our food systems, through things like food sharing, for instance. But we also learn through different vignettes is like why so many sort of policy issues sort of occur on this plate. It's a little bit differently for fisheries, but that's also like the idea that they share is that land, water, or other types of management structures were emerging in times where we could not participate with them. And that's why a lot of these structures tend to be sort of misaligned with our cultural values. But again, like I think the benefit of doing this type of thinking, like for you all, and this is why I do this in my classes too, is when we think about something like food passage, it allows us to understand again, like the web of problems that one thing can articulate, or one plate of food can articulate. And another thing that colonization has done that has impacted all of us is it's just like made it hard for us to know each other or like what issues matter. So that's why I focused on not just starting a bunch of conversations, but to give resources for people that if they want to keep learning about this stuff, they can. And I never underestimate like learning as like a first step. So with that said, that's all I have to say. So thank you all.
So you mentioned sort of differences that are inherent to Indigenous understandings of conservation versus what a lot of these pursue. Could you talk about how these two approaches could be maybe reconciled or incorporated differently?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Read our article. No, one thing we arrive at that Hans was doing at the Blue Hill Heritage Trust is they're shifting to a more active form of management. So a lot of conservation is based on we got to protect the nature. Let's say that protect the nature from humans. We don't touch it. We just let it do its thing, which is actually really problematic. That's why I always say like the wildfires are so intense now. So they got a lot more fuel load in them than they do in the past. So yeah, Indigenous food is also about care. So things that Blue Hill Heritage Trust were like, they did like a food forest that they work with the kids in the local schools with. Again, like the classrooms are coming back. So yeah, again, encouraging, and different groups are doing this as well, but there's also other groups who still have that same mindset. We don't touch the land or we don't do this. There's even like easements that are like forever wild. Like we don't touch this land at all. But again, like one of the reasons why the salmon and the sturgeon or the trees were so huge was because of Indigenous land care ethics. So a lot of that is coming back. So that report, I can't go up. You can look at for Indigenous land access, the Niweska case study is a good example of like what not having an easement or rules to do with the land can mean in terms of like land cares. Keep learning.
Anything from the room?
Another commenter in the chat would like to hear your perspective on the proposed industrial development on Sears Island, maybe how that relates to your talk today.
So for those of you unfamiliar with Sears Island, and again, I'm a public servant, so I'm not arguing for any types of policy. I just think it's the same thing that's been happening for 300 years. Like that Fort Pownell was literally there to disrupt Indigenous land access, and because it was such an important food place. And the state still retains that land and on Sears Island as well. So it's just an ongoing pattern of the same thing, holding on to that territory to develop in ways. Also, some of like the archaeological work is kind of a little fuzzy in Sears Island too, which kind of it's a reliance on physical evidence to support sort of decision making. So one of the important things was a lot of the clams that were in that area were actually dredged up to build the causeway out to Sears Island. But when you look at where the archaeological sites are in that area, they're like super close to that causeway. So like, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just saying it was probably quite possibly a lot of that stuff also is underneath that causeway too. So that's like my way of not answering that question and showing it's complex. And it's also just related to those ongoing policies and different views of the land.
Yeah.
You alluded a little bit to.
I did a lot of allusions.
Alluded to a lot of different things, somewhat more to the kind of the contamination issues with freshwater species, and I'm wondering kind of if there is kind of ways in which the changes in the management of these lands and these rivers would kind of be able to help compound the decontamination of these environments and for these species. Is that something that's part of your work at all, or is any of the stuff that with people whom you work with?
Yeah, I'm not that kind of scientist. I always talk to my wife, and I'm not that kind of doctor. But like how I would think about it was my thought. One, I think just in terms of the policy space and the work that MITSC is doing is we're learning like things like you may have rights to fish, like we have rights to those freshwater fish, but because of them being polluted, we can't actually fulfill those rights. It becomes this kind of murky area of what policy can do, because technically industries in Maine, like they're allowed to pollute. Now, if they pollute on accident, like oopsie, then it's actually a productive like policy move forward to kind of like remediate that. But in terms of like some of the more recent water standards, they're getting better. That's why, again, I could focus more in the meantime, like things like getting access to clams as a way to eat other sort of lower pollution relatives. But it's also becoming interesting because people are doing things like having wampum workshops, like learning how to work with the quahog shells, the hard shell clams. So like there's a lot of interest for that. So we can eat food, but also restore a lot of other like cultural connections to stuff as well. That's how I approach it. It's complex policy and how can I create access to other lower pollution?
Would you mind speaking a little bit more on what is sustenance by Maine's definition and who exactly has access to it?
Main sustenance is like, it's always this coffee mug. If I grabbed this fish from a river and I put it on my family's plate tonight and we ate that, that's sustenance. The moment I sell this to something else, it's a different category and could be punished by law. Going back to quahogs for a second, I love that relative because it can articulate so many different things about it. One, it's just directly a food source. It's really good for things like pastas if you like to get fancy. Lots of good things you can do with it. But again, the shells can be used for, one, historically used wampum for governance. So the beads, and we still have people who carry wampum belts as well. They can be used for ceremony if we put some smudge holes in it, and now we can burn our ceremonial medicines within that. When I bring Wabanaki youth out to dig clams, those become our classrooms for the day. So all of those different things are sustenance, and they all get wrapped up into that. But when the state gets to define what that means, then they can say things like, well, you shot this deer out of season to feed your family, here's your fine. It's just another way of saying that. So maybe it's also about like, your sovereignty and ability to do those things too. But
And is it only Indigenous people within Maine that sustenance applies
that's
to?
a good question. So in other places they use subsistence, but I think there's similarly like Eurocentric terms that have certain connotations to that. And if there's some nerds out there like me who want to dig into it more, there's this book, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's basically the study of when you started compartmentalizing fisheries like commercial, sustenance, or recreational, and it had intentional qualities to it. Like they weren't just creating these categories for the fun of it. It was, smart policymakers. People are looking at me with their hands up. I'm gonna let David do it.
Okay, I think the study of those words are so important because I think we could all feel the ridiculousness of it, the word sustenance, when you first started the presentation with that plate of gorgeous looking food, by the way. And realizing that wouldn't be by law like sustenance. And I'm getting the sense more and more that the restrictions and the laws put down are so indicative of how people aren't connected to the land and aren't talking to each other. And I thought the quick story you told about people coming together, I believe it was clammers or a lot of people coming into a meeting, and the first thing that you realized was, oh, we actually don't know each other, but we're all in this same field, doing the same work. And I don't know if you can talk more about meetings like that, why they matter so much, and maybe how they can advance policy conversations here and there about specifically access to those the food and land.
First off, just a selfish plug for river herring. May 23rd, the Bagadoos is doing they're kind of like their river herring sort of days. So they get around and see these fish migrating, and it's super fun. As many people should come as possible. But that was the first thing I thought of, is like these conversations about people like being disconnected from the land and from each other. So it's another way that colonization has impacted all of us. I'm like, we don't even know where our food comes from most of the time and who's had to grow it or what they've had to endure. But the Bagadoos restoration is unique because it was a fisher who was like, I had all these great memories of the river, this lake being full of herring. And it's not. And that started a lot of their restoration efforts. They're working with the town, they're working with like the Nature Conservancy, the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And when you go to these events, it's like none of who you are matters anymore. It's like you're there for the fish. But in terms of like what happens in terms of policy, I think no matter what kind of topic you're in, they all kind of have these people who, like, they're the ones who are connected, or they know a lot of the people in the town. Like when we do clam gathering, there's this guy, David, and we had this fire going and it was super huge. We're like, should we get a permit for this? And he's like, probably, but I know the fire marshal, so I'll give him a call if we need to. So if you're doing this work in communities, there tends to be these people who are kind of like the focal points. But yeah, getting people into those rooms together and like on the short term, like giving them something that they can see as a result of that work gets them to keep showing up. Because sometimes with like research, if that's like your primary outcome, sometimes the outcomes of the work doesn't happen until later. That's why like the conversation in the back, like I'm so interested in clam gathering activities because it's such an immediate impact in terms of like getting people. So yeah, find those people who are motivated and also like make sure you're giving back, you know, as early as you can so people keep showing up.
So I'm going to wrap things up here, but I feel sad to do it. However, I don't feel that sad because I'm going to keep talking to Tony for years to come. And I urge you to do the same, track him down somewhere. But if you're anything like me, you come away from this realizing there's just a lot of wonderful people here in our world out there on the front lines of stuff that really matters. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.